It was the fourth and final day of our 100-kilometer hike through the backcountry trails of northern Ontario. My wife, her cousin, and I had pushed hard from the beginning, pacing ourselves with just enough urgency to make the distance in time, but not so much that we'd burn out before we were halfway through. But now, with only 10 kilometers left, we were all feeling that heavy mix of soreness and anticipation that comes when you're almost done with something that's drained every part of you. Our legs were stiff, our shoulders raw from the packs, and every part of my body felt coated in a layer of dirt, sweat, and fatigue. The trail had been no joke from the start. Steep climbs that punished your thighs, long root-covered descents that tested your ankles with every step, stretches of slick granite that turned to ice in the early mornings, and hot plates by mid-afternoon. We had fought bugs, blisters, and the occasional bout of short tempers. By day 4, we weren't really talking much. The conversations had stopped hours ago. We were just marching forward, one boot in front of the other, tunnel vision focused on the end. We came around a bend in the trail near a shallow creek, where the sunlight was barely cutting through the thick tree canopy. That's where we saw them, 2 girls sitting on the side of the trail, just off the main path in the dirt and pine needles. At first I thought they were just taking a break, but as we got closer, it was clear something was wrong. Their faces were blotchy, and their eyes were swollen and red, like they'd been crying for hours or hadn't slept for days. Their skin looked dry and irritated, especially around the eyes and nose. One of them had her head tilted down, her arms wrapped around her legs, while the other was looking right at us with a look that was half relief and half hopelessness. Neither of them said anything at first. They didn't smile or wave or even really move. The one looking at us just sort of blinked, slow and sluggish, like it took all her energy to keep her eyes open. I remember that moment clearly, the way they looked like they hadn't had a full thought in days, like something had completely short-circuited in them. I was about to ask if they were okay when the other one finally stood up, unsteady and wincing, and started talking, sort of rambling. But one word stuck out: mace. They had accidentally set off bear mace in their backpack and on themselves 2 days ago. It took a second to process. We just stood there listening while the one who could speak explained what had happened in a few broken, tired sentences. Apparently the canister had somehow discharged in their pack, sprayed its contents across their gear, and they'd gotten a full dose of it on themselves. Eyes, faces, arms, everything exposed. No water to rinse off, no help nearby. They had been stuck out there trying to find the trail again, coughing, burning, confused. They didn't even know how far they were from the trailhead. The air suddenly felt heavier. We had passed the last major junction about an hour ago, and the thought of being stuck out there in that kind of pain, that kind of disorientation with no idea how far you had left, it made my chest tighten. I've had a close call or two with bear spray when I was younger and dumb, but never anything like what they had just gone through. The skin on their faces looked raw, like they'd gotten too close to a campfire and stayed there. We pointed them in the right direction, told them it was maybe 10 kilometers more, just a few hours if they could keep moving. Neither of us had anything left to give, not even extra food or water. We had planned our trip tightly, and with the miles ahead, there just wasn't room to stop and help beyond giving directions. I hated that feeling. I remember thinking about them for the rest of the hike, wondering if they'd make it before dark, if they'd find someone else, or if they'd collapse somewhere off the trail and wait it out. But we kept walking. That's what you do on the trail. Sometimes you can't do more. You just walk. About 2 hours later, after another long, grinding climb followed by a knee-busting descent, we saw another group coming up the trail ahead. For guys all lean and fast-moving, like they weren't hiking but racing. They were trail runners. You could tell by the light packs, the lack of gear, the sweat-soaked shirts, and the steady rhythm in their footsteps. As we passed them, we all slowed down for a second. The 3 in front looked exhausted but controlled, focused. But the 4th guy in the back was a completely different story. He was pale, ghost-like. Not just pale from exhaustion, but pale like he hadn't had blood in his face for hours. His lips were cracked and colorless, his eyes wide and distant, staring at the ground just in front of his feet. He didn't seem to see us or anything else. He looked like he was being dragged forward by sheer willpower or maybe just habit. I remember how quiet he was, how his body sort of leaned forward like it was too much effort to hold himself up straight anymore. Every step he took looked like it hurt, like his knees were about to give out, but his brain hadn't gotten the message yet. One of the other guys had a hand hovering near him, like he was ready to catch him if he collapsed, but didn't want to slow down unless he had to. I learned later, through a trip report someone posted online, that they were trying to complete the entire 100 kilometers loop in under 48 hours. No sleep, barely any stopping. Just constant movement, food on the go, and maybe a short rest when absolutely necessary. I couldn't understand it. That trail had chewed us up and we were taking it slow with full gear and sleep every night. The idea of running it nonstop felt like madness. Watching that fourth guy, I realized just how thin the line was between adventure and something darker, something dangerous. That image of him stuck with me. His blank expression, his stumbling steps. He wasn't in control anymore. He was beyond tired. He was in survival mode, and whatever pride or thrill had carried him into that challenge was long gone. It was just about finishing now. Or maybe it was about not being the one to quit, even if it meant hurting himself worse. By the time we made it to the parking lot, the sun was starting to dip low and the shadows stretched across the gravel like long fingers. The lot was mostly empty, just a few vehicles, and the silence felt strange after 4 days of constant rustling leaves, snapping branches, and buzzing bugs. My legs felt like rubber, and every step I took after dropping my pack made me feel like I was floating, disconnected. We sat on the tailgate of our car for a long while before even thinking about driving. I kept picturing those girls, dragging themselves down the trail, eyes burning and skin raw, and that runner, glazed over and silent, maybe collapsing behind us somewhere in the woods. That trail took something out of everyone, some more than others. I've done hard hikes before. I've dealt with pain and cold and blisters that made me limp for days. But that trip reminded me just how close you can get to the edge out there without even realizing it. It's not always a dramatic fall or a wild animal or a sudden storm. Sometimes it's slower, quieter. A wrong turn, a stupid mistake with a canister, a challenge that goes too far. That trail was beautiful, no doubt, but it didn't care who you were or what shape you were in. Took what it wanted from you and gave nothing back. It was up to you to make it out. I remember it way too clearly. It was day 2 of a 3-day hike, and we were closing in on the peak of Blood Mountain. The name sounded cool at first, kind of epic, kind of badass. But by that second day, my legs ached like I'd been walking on broken glass. My back was slick with sweat under the straps of my pack, and my stomach was making noises I hadn't heard come out of a living human before. I'd had a weird breakfast that morning. Something like freeze-dried eggs and oatmeal that had rehydrated just a little too cold and sat like a rock in my gut. I tried to ignore it, but the pressure was building all morning. By the time we were climbing the last few hundred feet, I knew I couldn't hold it anymore. The problem was the location. There was barely any cover. It was broad daylight, and the foliage was too thin to hide behind. Every bush looked like it had been trimmed by a blind guy with hedge clippers. The trees were tall and thin, spaced just far enough apart to leave you exposed from every angle. Every time I tried to scope out a place off-trail, someone would come crunching up the path behind us or descending from the other direction. I was trying to keep it together, but my gut was twisting. And then I saw it. Just off to the right of the trail, behind some rocks and half covered in ivy, was the structure. Toilet. Not a real toilet, not one of those plastic porta potties you see at festivals. This was made of wood, 3 thick, weather-worn walls and a door. It didn't look like it had been put there by a parks department. It looked like someone had dragged it up there years ago and just left it. I couldn't see the inside from the trail, and maybe that was for the best. But I was desperate. I walked over to it, dragging my feet, ignoring the looks from a couple hikers sitting nearby. I could smell it before I touched the door. A thick, sour stench that clung to the air like humidity. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the metal latch on the warped wooden door, and in that second, I felt this wave of dread crawl over me. Not fear exactly, just pure hesitation. I didn't want to open that door, but I did. Inside was worse than anything I imagined. The toilet was just a bench with a cutout hole. Underneath the hole was a huge bin, metal or plastic, I couldn't tell, filled with who knows how many weeks, maybe months of hiker waste. The smell hit me like a wall. It wasn't just gross. It was alive. It had layers. There was the sharp ammonia of urine, the thick rot of old feces, the sourness of something moldy, and the unmistakable smell of something dead or dying. Flies buzzed in thick black clouds, coating the walls, the seat, the air. You couldn't look anywhere without seeing them. Still, I needed to go. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, hoping the old wood would block out some of the smell, but it didn't. If anything, it concentrated it. I gagged. Not just a dry heave, a real, deep gut roll that almost brought up breakfast. My eyes watered. I told myself I'd be fast. Just open the lid, hold my breath, do my business, and get out. I opened the lid. I don't know what I expected. Maybe a slow waft of stink. Maybe a few flies lazily drifting up. But what happened was more violent than anything I could have imagined. The second the lid cracked, it was like I'd lit a fuse. A torrent of flies burst out. They didn't just rise, they exploded. Like someone had set off a firecracker inside a trash can. Dozens, maybe hundreds, flew out in a mad, panicked rush, swirling around me in a thick storm of wings and noise. I couldn't see for a second. I dropped the lid and swatted blindly at my face, spinning in the small space, trying not to fall backward into the hole. They were everywhere. On my neck, my arms, my shirt, my face. Some of them were so big you could feel the weight of them when they hit. I wanted to scream, but I didn't want my mouth open. I crouched, curled into myself, and waited. I figured they'd eventually calm down, find their way out. They didn't. Some did, but others, maybe 50 or 60, just kept flying in slow, desperate circles, confused and angry. Some landed on the seat. Some crawled on the door. A few buzzed right in front of my eyes, like they were trying to challenge me for being there. I waited, holding my breath in bursts, trying to stay as still as possible. Eventually, I got back up and tried again. I wiped the seat with a paper towel, still covered in specks of black. I turned around, unbuckled, and got ready to finally sit. And that's when the worst part happened. As I lowered myself, I felt it. A sudden, unmistakable tickle against my thigh, then another on my lower back, then another on the inside of my leg. The flies, the ones I hadn't seen, the ones I had blocked from escaping, they were crawling, trying to find daylight, and I was in their way. That was it. Panicked, I shot up, knocking the seat lid halfway closed again and smacking my back against the wooden wall. I scrambled with my shorts, nearly falling into the bin trying to get out of there. I pushed the door open so hard it banged into the side of the frame and stayed there, half open. I ran, just ran, into the woods, my pants half up, my pack hanging crooked from one shoulder, away from the stench, the flies, the death trap someone had labeled a toilet. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of a rocky outcrop looking over the valley. There was a little patch of flat dirt near a few boulders, far from the trail. I dropped my pack, paced in a circle to calm my breathing, then finally gave in and did what I needed to do, out in the open under the sky the way nature meant it. No walls, no doors, no metal bins filled with weeks of rot. That night we camped not far from the peak. The spot was beautiful, serene, even a small clearing tucked into the trees with just enough wind to keep bugs at bay. We cooked a quiet dinner, watched the stars come out one by one, and lay back in our sleeping bags with sore feet and full stomachs. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door, the flies, that 1 second where I felt them against my skin, those disgusting little legs brushing me as they scrambled to escape. I didn't sleep well, not because of the cold or the noise, but because every time I closed my eyes, I felt like they were still there, on me, in my clothes, hiding in the seams of my pack, watching. I told myself it was over. It was just a bad toilet on a hard day. But something about it stuck. I'd used bad bathrooms before. Pit toilets, sketchy gas stations, even holes in the desert. But that thing on Blood Mountain wasn't just poorly built. It shouldn't have been there. It looked like it had been forgotten. like the mountain had decided to keep it for itself and let it rot slowly in the sun and wind. Next morning, we hiked the last few miles down the other side. It was a beautiful descent. Steep switchbacks, soft pine needles underfoot, sun filtering through tall trees. But I didn't stop once. Not for water, not for photos, not even to rest. I just kept walking, like if I moved fast enough, the memory wouldn't follow me. But it did. Even now, back home, when I see a wooden shed or hear the low buzz of a fly in the kitchen, I think of that place, that door, that feeling, and it reminds me that sometimes the scariest thing on a mountain isn't a bear or a fall or the cold. Sometimes it's what we build and leave behind. I still remember how cold that night was, even now. It was my second or third backpacking trip, and I still didn't know what I was doing. I was trying, though. I'd bought myself a proper sleeping bag this time, a mummy bag with down insulation, rated for -10 degrees. I thought that meant I'd be perfectly fine in the low 40s. I didn't know that using it properly was just as important as having it in the first place. I didn't shake it out before I used it. I didn't even know I was supposed to. I'd pulled it straight out of the compression sack and just slid into it like I was getting into bed at home. I didn't tighten the hood around my head either. I left it loose and open, with a small circle above my face to breathe through. I didn't think anything of it at the time. In fact, I was proud of how snug it felt, how warm I thought I'd be, wrapped up like that under the trees. The temperature started to drop shortly after sundown. I could feel it when I stepped away from the fire to pee. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the air cut across my skin like it was angry. Still, I felt okay. I crawled into my bag for the night, zipped it up all the way, laid back, and tried to fall asleep. But the warmth never came. First, I figured I just needed to give it time. That maybe I was just a little cold from being outside and I'd heat up soon. I waited, curled up tighter, pulled the bag up higher on my shoulders and tucked my hands between my thighs. Still cold. I could feel it gathering around my legs first, especially my feet. Then it crept up to my hips and down into my fingers. It wasn't that sharp kind of cold that makes you gasp. It was more like the steady, dull ache, like something seeping into you from the outside and pulling all the warmth out of your body 1 inch at a time. I started to shiver. At first, it was small, little muscle twitches in my shoulders. Then it turned into full body shakes, rattling through my ribs and up into my jaw. My teeth chattered so hard it hurt. I didn't sleep that night, not a single minute. I just laid there, curled in a tight ball, trying to conserve whatever body heat I still had. But I'd left that hole at the top of the bag, right above my face, and all my heat was just going straight out. It acted like a chimney, pulling warmth away from me. I didn't realize it then, but by not shaking out the down, I'd left the insulation all compressed. That meant it wasn't trapping heat the way it was supposed to. I may as well have been wrapped in wet newspaper. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't. I just kept telling myself it would be over in the morning, that the sun would come up, that someone would wake up and start a fire. I knew if I made it to sunrise, I'd be okay. When the light finally started to break through the trees, it felt like I'd survived something huge. I was numb. My fingers, my toes, even my lips. My head ached from all the shivering, and my limbs moved like they didn't belong to me. I fumbled with the zipper, struggling to get out of the bag. Every movement hurt. The air on my skin felt like sandpaper. I forced myself to move. I forced myself to get dressed, to walk toward the center of camp. Someone had already gotten a fire going, and I hovered near it like my life depended on it. I didn't say anything. I just held my hands over the flames and tried to stop shaking. Someone handed me a cup of hot oatmeal, and I remember trying to hold the cup steady and failing. But I ate. I got it down. I kept telling myself that I was fine now, that I'd made it through the worst of it. And for a little while, it felt like I had. The sun came out fully, and the cold started to lift. I felt strength returning to my legs. My fingers stopped hurting. I got my pack together, cinched everything down, and clipped the straps across my chest and hips. I was still tired, but we were heading out. The trail wasn't long. I could make it, but maybe 20 or 30 minutes into the hike, something weird happened. I felt the weight on my back suddenly shift. At first, I thought maybe I hadn't tightened the straps enough and the load had just shifted down. I paused, leaning slightly forward, trying to readjust. Then it happened all at once. The entire pack just dropped off my back. It didn't fall off me completely because I still had the waist strap clipped, but everything above my waist just sagged backward like someone had yanked it off. I heard the gear hit the ground with a dull thud behind me. I stood there frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. I reached behind me to grab the shoulder straps, and they weren't there. They were just gone. When I turned around and looked, I saw my pack lying flat on the trail, still connected to my waist, but nothing else holding it up. The straps had come completely detached from the body of the pack. It looked like someone had just sliced them off. I crouched down to look closer and realized the stitching that had held the webbing together had come undone. Not just one spot, but several. It must have been slowly unraveling over the hike in, and I never noticed. Now it had completely failed, and there I was, staring at a broken pack halfway through a cold morning in the middle of the woods. I felt this deep, frustrated panic rising in my chest. I'd already gone through the freezing night. I was running on no sleep, barely warmed up, and now I had no way to carry my gear. I tried to think straight. I wasn't alone, thankfully. It was a group trip. I knew I wasn't going to be stranded or anything, but the idea of finishing the hike with all my stuff basically dragging behind me like a broken sled, that felt humiliating. I tried to make it work. I used the waist strap to keep the pack against my lower back and tied one of my extra jackets around the body of the pack and looped the sleeves over my shoulders like a makeshift harness. It barely worked. The weight pulled hard on my hips, and every step felt uneven. I had to stop every 10 minutes to readjust. My shoulders ached, my legs were tired, and I still hadn't fully warmed up from the night before. That trail out felt 10 times longer than the one we came in on. When we finally made it to the parking area where our cars were, I dropped the pack to the ground and just sat next to it, completely drained. My hands were dirty from gripping trees and gear. My back was sore from the uneven weight, and I still had that chilled feeling deep in my core that hadn't gone away since the night before. But I made it. Somehow, that trip taught me more than anything I'd read online or seen in gear reviews. I learned how dangerous inexperience can be, that even expensive gear won't save you if you don't use it right, that hypothermia doesn't always come in dramatic ways. Sometimes it just creeps in slowly while you lie there thinking you're doing fine, and that a pack falling off your back in the middle of the woods can feel like the last straw when you're already barely holding it together. I still go backpacking. I still love it. But I never forgot that trip. Now, every time I pack my bag, I check every strap, every stitch. I shake out my sleeping bag. I cinch the hood tight. I don't take shortcuts, not anymore, because I know exactly how it feels to be cold, broken, and barely hanging on in the middle of nowhere. And I have no intention of feeling that again. I left before daylight, just as the first hint of light might have been rising somewhere way out on the edge of the hills, but not where I was. It was still full dark under the tree cover. No moon, heavy clouds above, and thick timber in every direction. I knew the area pretty well. I'd been there a couple years back, spent a lot of time roaming around those hills. Hunting, exploring, just being out. That time it had felt familiar, rugged but welcoming. I figured this trip would be the same. I parked my truck on the far side of one of the bigger hills, thinking I'd make a loop during the day and come back up and over it by evening. I had packed light, no tent, just a day pack, headlamp, water, and some food. The plan was simple. Hike the ridgeline, drop down into a few valleys I'd remembered, maybe follow a creek bed for a while, and then cut back across the saddle to reach my truck again. But as soon as I stepped into the trees, something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The ground felt uneven, but not just in the way wooded terrain normally does. It felt like I was misstepping more than usual, like I was always just a few inches off balance. My breath was heavier too. I chalked it up to the darkness and my body not being fully awake yet. I pressed on, But within the first hour, I was already slowing down more than I should have been. The hills twisted more than I remembered. I had to stop again and again just to make sure I wasn't walking in circles. My legs felt like they were moving through mud, and my arms hung heavy at my sides. I sat on a rock mid-morning and noticed how drenched I was in sweat. Even though the air was cool and still, my shirt was sticking to my back like I'd been running. I barely touched my breakfast. My appetite was gone, and I had to force myself to drink. Still, I kept going. I told myself it was just fatigue. I hadn't hiked this terrain in a while, and maybe I'd overestimated my stamina. I pushed deeper into the timber, following deer trails, cutting across low brush, moving up and down sharp slopes. The day stayed gray, and by noon I was starting to feel lightheaded. My legs were shaking every time I stopped. I sat longer at each break, staring blankly at the trees and feeling almost outside of myself. Something was off, really off. I started thinking maybe I'd picked up some kind of bug, maybe food poisoning. I tried to eat again and gagged. My head was pounding, but not in a normal way. It was like a tight ring had been cinched around my temples. Still, I didn't panic. I've always been stubborn about finishing what I start, and I was already deep in the woods. I figured I'd cut my loop short, head back early, and rest up in the truck before driving out. So I changed course. Rather than looping back around the long way, I decided to cut straight over the big hill, the one where my truck was parked on the far side. I remembered it being a steady climb, nothing too difficult, just a long wooded rise. It would take me maybe a couple hours, even in my current state. The sun was starting to drop lower behind the clouds, and I wanted to be over that hill before it got dark again. But when I reached the base of the hill, my stomach dropped. It was gone. Not the hill itself, it was still there, but the trees, the cover, everything that had once made it familiar were stripped away. It had been clear-cut. The entire hillside was bare, a wide, ugly wound across the land. Fresh piles of twisted limbs, broken logs, stripped bark, and deep ruts from heavy equipment were scattered everywhere. What used to be a thick, dark forest was now an open mess of pulpwood chaos. I hadn't heard about any logging in the area, but I hadn't really been paying attention either. There was no path anymore, no cover, no bearings. The hill, once a quiet green incline, was now a tangle of splinters and destruction. The ground was slick in places and jagged in others. I couldn't walk a straight line if I tried. I had to pick my way over and around fallen trees, scramble through gaps, duck under twisted trunks. Every time I thought I was getting close to the top, a new pile of tangled mess blocked the way. I started zigzagging. I'd go left around a broken trunk, then right to avoid a pit of mud, then back left again to climb over a slab of shredded bark. I must have crossed that hill 100 different directions without ever really moving forward. The sun went down somewhere behind the clouds, and the gray light disappeared. I didn't even realize it had gotten dark until I stopped to rest and noticed I couldn't see the valley below anymore. I turned on my headlamp and kept going. My hands were shaking now. My legs were numb. I had to use my hands to crawl over some of the larger piles. I slipped more times than I can count. Once, I landed flat on my back and just lay there, staring up at the sky, unable to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was thudding in my ears. I didn't feel scared exactly, but I knew I was in trouble. What scared me more than anything was the thought that no one really knew exactly where I was. I told people I was heading back into the woods, maybe near that valley, maybe near the ridge, but I hadn't given anyone coordinates or a set plan. If I didn't make it out, it would take a while for anyone to even start looking, and they wouldn't know where to begin. That thought gave me just enough of a jolt to get back on my feet. When I finally crested the top of the hill, my eyes burned with sweat and fatigue. The other side sloped down into a drainage area I remembered. There was still some timber left on that side, and I used the last of my strength to push through the brush and follow a rough deer trail down. My knees gave out twice. I slid down part of the hill on my backside, hands raw from grabbing at saplings and roots to slow my fall. At the bottom, I could see the faint shimmer of metal through the trees, my truck. I almost cried when I saw it. I limped to it, unlocked it with numb fingers, and crawled into the cab. I didn't even take off my pack. I just sat there, shaking, sweating, breathing hard. It was full dark now, and the woods outside looked colder than ever. I drove. I don't know how. My hands cramped on the wheel, and I could barely sit upright. I was 1 hour out from my in-laws' place, and the road felt like it stretched forever. My vision blurred a few times. My foot slipped off the pedal once or twice. But I made it somehow. Pulled into their driveway well past dark and barely made it to the door before collapsing inside. I spent the entire next day in bed. Couldn't keep any food down. Couldn't move without feeling like the room was spinning. I had no idea what had happened to me. I just knew it wasn't normal. 2 days later, after finally managing to get to a doctor, I found out it was the onset of diabetes. My blood sugar had crashed hard out there. The weakness, the dizziness, the sweat, the confusion. It all made sense afterward. I'd been going through a full-blown physical attack without knowing it. If I'd passed out in those woods, especially in that mess of a clear-cut hill, no one would have found me. I would have just disappeared into that broken terrain. Looking back, I realized how close it was. I didn't recognize it at the time because I chalked everything up to exhaustion or being out of shape. But it wasn't just a tough hike. It was my body failing, and I was completely alone. Now, even when I go back into the woods, I always tell someone exactly where I'm going. I don't take early warning signs lightly anymore. That hike nearly ended me, not because of anything out there in the wild, but because something inside me was quietly breaking down, and I didn't listen until it was almost too late. I've hiked a lot of trails over the years, parts of the Appalachian Trail, long stretches of the Pacific Crest Trail, and everything in between. I've camped in rain, snow, and desert winds. I've been hungry, sunburned, bitten by spiders, and followed by wild animals. But there are a few nights that stick in my mind more than the others. Not because of nature, but because of people. I was somewhere in Virginia. I think it might have been Glasgow, though I'm not entirely sure anymore. It was one of those days where I'd hiked longer than planned. My legs were done, and the sun was dropping fast. I came into this clearing where a couple other tents were already set up. It was flat, dry, and near a water source, so it looked like a good spot. I set up my tent, ate a quick cold dinner, some tuna and tortillas, and then wandered toward the small fire someone had started. It's common on the trail for hikers to hang out by the fire at night. Usually it's people swapping stories, warming their hands, drying socks. Nothing weird. That night, though, it was different. 2 guys I hadn't seen before were already there when I came up. They didn't have backpacks, which was the first thing that felt off. Everyone on the trail has gear, even the ultralight folks. But these 2 had nothing. Just dirty clothes, a beat-up duffel bag between them, and a big bottle of cheap whiskey that they were passing back and forth. They looked rough. Not just trail rough. I mean street rough. Greasy hair, yellow teeth, eyes that didn't quite focus right. They didn't look like hikers. They didn't look like they belonged out there at all. At first, they just laughed and mumbled to each other. I stayed on the other side of the fire, kept to myself. Then they started asking me weird questions, repeating the same one again and again. How old are you? Where are you from? You out here alone? Over and over. Same questions, slightly different tone each time. I didn't say much. I just nodded, poked at the fire with a stick, trying to seem unbothered. But my gut felt tight. My hands were cold even though the fire was warm. They started talking about things I didn't want to hear. Dark things. One of them told a story about setting a dog on fire. He laughed while he told it. The other guy said something about how it smelled when it burned. Then they started talking about people they knew who had killed someone once. Stories that sounded more personal than secondhand. It was like they were trying to outdo each other, one horrible story after another. And they kept looking at me while they talked, grinning, like they were checking my reaction, like they wanted to see fear. I didn't move. I just stayed calm. Inside, I was running through my options. My knife was back in my tent. My bear spray too. I never expected to need those things at a campsite like this. I scanned the fire circle again, looking for anyone else. That's when I saw 2 big guys across the firelight. They were sitting just beyond the glow, drinking water from Nalgene bottles, watching quietly. I recognized one of them from earlier that day. He'd passed me on the trail, moving fast with a heavy pack. Military haircut, tall, lean build. The other guy looked the same. Camouflage gear, clean, straight posture. They didn't say anything, but they stayed by the fire, like a silent buffer between me and the two creeps. That changed things. The mood shifted a little. The two drunk guys noticed them too and got quieter. Still drunk, still weird, but they weren't saying the worst things out loud anymore. I don't know what would have happened if those two army guys hadn't been there. I went back to my tent early and zipped it shut. Every little sound outside made me freeze. A twig snap, wind in the trees. My heart wouldn't slow down, but the two men didn't come near my tent that night. I think they knew not to. When I woke up, they were gone. No duffel bag, no trash, nothing. Just ash in the fire pit and some muddy footprints heading off toward the woods. The two army guys were still there, packing up. I nodded at them as I left, and they nodded back. That was it. No words, just quiet understanding. That was one of the worst nights on the Appalachian Trail, but not the only bad one. The PCT gave me more to remember, and not always in good ways. A few weeks later, I was deep in the desert section of California, somewhere south of Tehachapi. I had just come down out of the mountains after a long climb and was heading into the valley below. The land was dry, open, and exposed. No shade, no shelter. It was getting toward late afternoon, and I knew I needed to find a campsite soon. As I looked behind me to scan the horizon, I saw something I couldn't process at first. Huge black fingers rising over the ridge. Long, thick shapes curling in the sky like smoke or claws. Took a second to realize what it was. A sandstorm, a massive one coming fast. The whole front of it was shaped like a hand, pushing straight down the trail toward me. I didn't think. I just started running. My pack bounced, the straps cutting into my shoulders, but I didn't stop. I dropped maybe 600 feet in elevation in half an hour. I kept looking for a low spot, somewhere with even a little protection. Eventually, I found a sunken washout, maybe 4 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with some rocks and dead shrubs around it. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best I had. I threw down my pack, grabbed my tent, and started pitching it in full panic mode. The wind was already picking up, blowing sand into my eyes and mouth. I couldn't see straight. I used big rocks to weigh down the tent corners, stuffed gear inside, and crawled in just as the first wave hit. The sound was deafening, not like rain, more like millions of fingernails scraping metal. The wind pushed so hard against the tent walls that they folded in, flattening against my face. I held the poles with both hands and braced my feet against my backpack. I could feel every gust, every vibration. Every second felt like it could be the one where the whole thing ripped apart and left me exposed. Couldn't sleep. I didn't even lay down. I just sat there all night, breathing through my buff, blinking through grit, waiting for the walls to collapse. By morning, it was calm again. The sky was clear. My tent was somehow still standing. One of the poles had bent, but the fabric held. I was covered in sand. My gear, my clothes, even my teeth, everything gritty. I stood outside the tent, looking up at the mountains, and felt this strange mix of relief and disbelief. I had no right to be that lucky. That tent saved me. Not my skill, not my strength, just a good design, some rocks, and a bit of luck. The PCT tested me again not long after that. Somewhere near Northern California, I got bit by a spider. I didn't see it happen, just woke up one morning with a red spot on my thigh. It itched like hell. Over the next 2 days, it swelled and turned purple, then black. The skin peeled. It oozed. I had to hike out early and get to a small clinic off-trail. They said it was probably a brown recluse. The nurse gave me antibiotics and a warning. I took care of it, wrapped it up every morning before hiking, but it hurt with every step. The trail doesn't wait for healing. On top of that, I got the worst sunburns of my life. There's a stretch in the Sierra Nevada where the sun just bakes you from above and reflects off the snow below. I wore sunscreen, but not enough. The backs of my hands peeled. My ears cracked. My shoulders blistered through my shirt. It felt like fire every time I moved. There were moments where I wanted to quit, but I kept walking. That's the thing about the trail. You hurt, you sweat, you bleed, but you don't stop. You just keep going. Even now, years later, I think about those nights. The firelight in Virginia, the wind screaming through the tent walls, the spider bite, the sunburns, the cracked lips and chapped hands. I've had people ask me why I kept hiking after all that, why I didn't pack it in and go home. The truth is, I don't know. Maybe it's something in my bones. Maybe it's because no matter how bad it got, the trail still gave me something I couldn't find anywhere else. Safety is never guaranteed out there. Sometimes it's nature, sometimes it's people. But there's a kind of clarity you get when you're living out of your pack, trusting your feet to carry you, knowing your life depends on small decisions, where to camp, how much water to carry, when to run and when to stay still. It strips everything down. You don't forget the bad moments, but you survive them, you learn from them, and you keep walking.